These are just some photos I took of the little plaster sculptures in the Rodin Museum. On display and in reserve in the Rodin Museum in Paris are many of Rodin's plaster sculptures. They are often partial figures, fragments of bodies, including arms, hands and feet, works without dates, without titles and without histories of enlargement, bronze casting or carving. They were not exhibited, seldom photographed or commented upon by visitors to the studios and to his home. They were the unknown works of Rodin, the white works of plaster. Traditionally in sculpture, as I've just mentioned, plaster marks an interval, a temporary and intermediary site between the living plasticity of the clay and the frozen permanence of the bronze cast or marble carving. Yet the processes that Rodin employed in making and remaking the works in plaster, including dipping them in liquid plaster, was his way of resuscitating and breathing new life and meaning into the remnants and fragments that had belonged to his other sculptures. The liquid plaster, and he was literally dipping these small plaster sculptures into buckets of fresh plaster. The liquid plaster had the effect of concealing discrepancies in proportion and the identity of sexual parts, and allowed even violent gestures to appear imprisoned within the form itself. It created a sense of the image withdrawing or turning back into the form beneath an opaque veil. Now, the direct observation of the making of these unknown works had a profound influence on the young Rilke. 2 years after Rodin's death, Rilke wrote, "These fragmentary, posthumous works are permanently assured of a link with Rodin's surviving oeuvre. These posthumous works were the collected remains, the acres of fragments from the major commissions and other exhibited works." In a letter to his wife Clara, herself a student of Rodin, Rilke provides a description of a large pavilion of plaster casts in Rodin's gardens at Meudon. He says, "It is a tremendously great and strange sight, this vast white hall with its dazzling figures, looking out from the many high glass doors like the denizens of an aquarium. You see, even before you have entered, that all these hundreds of lives are one life, vibrations of one force and one will." The luminosity of the figures framed within the glass enclosures suggested some strange aquatic accretion comprised of hundreds of smaller organisms. This impression must have been most compelling at those times of the day when, in subdued light, plaster gives the appearance of emitting a glow. This glow has the effect of dissolving all surface detail and incident into a unified form. Such moments would have magnified the illusion of a singular, though multifaceted organism contained behind the glass of the pavilion. Rodin recorded seeing some of the enormous glass windows Rilke recorded seeing some of the enormous glass windows filled entirely with the fragments of the gates of hell. These works, submerged within the light of their environment, were the embodiment of dissolved suffering and unhappiness, as though plaster itself materialized all the images of fateful destiny, despair, death, and suicide contained in Dante's poem. For Rilke, the whole scene was indescribable. He wrote, "Acres of fragments lie there, one beside the other, nudes the size of my hand and no bigger, but only bits, scarcely one of them whole. Often only a piece of arm, a piece of leg, just as they go together, and the portion of the body which belongs to them. Here the torso of one figure, with the head of another stuck onto it, with the arm of a third." This scene must have looked like some haunting collection of calligraphy, a raw and primal alphabet comprised of body parts, whose syntax, lexicon, grammar and rules were still being negotiated. The particular poignancy of this scene would not have been lost on a young poet struggling to find the original elements of a language which could form the structure of his work. Here was the sculptural equivalent to language laid bare. stripped of all convention, ornament and artifice. But it was a language that could be held, grasped, stuck together, made to speak in its own way, according to its own laws, a language of infinite generation and regeneration that would endure all the grafting, shaping, wounding, breaking, scratching and carving performed by the sculptor. And the sea of whiteness laid out across the studio floor must have reminded the poet of his obligation to the page, the white ground of his own work. Throughout his monograph on Rodin, Rilke made frequent reference to these works, to their materiality and to their mystery. He wrote, "Here beside me is another work, a quiet face to which belongs a hand, expressive of suffering, and the plaster has the transparent whiteness. And now I find myself among objects, all of which are new and nameless. They keep no count of time." He describes another work as a small thing whose name you have forgotten, made out of a white shining embrace which holds together like a knot. What is nameless and what is forgotten in language nevertheless emerges in a stark materiality. This failure of language, its aphasia or poverty, stood in contrast to the apparent fluidity and eloquence of the small sculptures. These little works from the Rodin Museum, you can see the places where Rodin has drawn on them, where he's carved them, where he's just stuck these little extraordinary little bodies together, dipped them in plaster to make entirely new, strange, utterly strange forms. Here you can see something again of the sort of matter-of-fact working techniques of Rodin. So, from his detailed observations of Rodin's studio practice, Rilke saw that what lay at the origin of the sculptor's achievement was a commitment to the observation of things and processes located in the everyday. His art was not based upon any great idea, Rilke writes, but upon the conscientious realization of something small, upon something capable of achievement, upon a matter of technique. And he also said, the artist has the right to make one thing out of many and a world out of the smallest part of it. Rilke identified a form of perception, a way of seeing that enabled Rodin to treat the world, the organic and the inorganic, as a singular substance, entity and surface. He wrote, and I hope you forgive me for reading this fairly lengthy quote, but I'm really just indulging my great love for Rilke. And, you know, in one sense, it's almost as though one could stand here tonight and simply read from this extraordinary little book, Rilke's book, his essays on Rodin. You could simply stand here and read them, and it would be the most extraordinary description of Rodin's work, which is so relevant today, more than 100 years after it was written. So forgive me for this lengthy quote, but I'm going to read it anyway, because it's been something that has really sustained me so much in my own practice from the time, as I said, from the time I was 17 and I first came across Rilke's writing. So Rilke had this to say about the way Rodin treated the world as a surface. He said, "Let us for a moment consider whether everything before us, everything we observe, explain and interpret, does not consist simply of surfaces. What we might call mind and spirit and love, are these things not only a slight change seen on the small surface of our neighbour's face, and must not the artist, who would give us these things in plastic form, keep to the tangible elements which is in keeping with his medium, to the form he can lay hold of and imitate?" This is an extraordinary idea, that for Rilke, everything in the world has to be achievable if you're an artist. You make everything in the world in the form that you work with, in the medium that you work with. You reduce it. You find a way of translating it into that medium. Rilke goes on, For all the happiness that has ever thrilled the heart, all greatness, even to think of that which almost destroys us, every spacious, world-transforming idea, for every one of these things, there was a moment when these were nothing but a pursing of the lips, the lifting of the eyebrows, or the shadow on a brow, and this contour of the mouth, this line above the eyelids, this shadow on a face. Perhaps they have previously existed in exactly similar form as a marking on an animal, a fissure in a rock, a hollow in a fruit. ... Then Rilke says, there is only one single surface which suffers 1,000 changes and transformations. It was possible to think of the whole world for a moment under this conception, so that it became simple and was placed as a task in the hands of a man who thought it so. For the endowment of an object with life of its own does not depend on great ideas, but upon whether such ideas can create a métier, a daily labour, something that remains with one to the end. So, through his efforts to understand what the sculptor had done and how he had succeeded in finding a daily process of working, Rilke came to understand what he himself had to do as a young poet and how he had to proceed as a maker of poems. Rilke is fascinated by Rodin's sense of touch, how touch becomes a determining element of form. He writes, "The work of the modelling had to be carried out so humbly, so obediently, so devoutly, so impartially on face and hand and body, that no specific part remained, and the artist worked at the form without knowing what exactly would result, like a worm working its way from point to point in the dark." He continues, "A hand laid on the shoulder or limb of another body is no longer part of the body to which it properly belongs. Something new has been formed from it, and the object it touches or holds. Something which was not there before, which is nameless and belongs to no one." Here one can think of Rodin's creating something new, something nameless, as a translation or transformation of his experience of touch. And in sculpture, perhaps more than any other art form, sculpture is an art of touch. A work of sculpture is always the result of some sort of touch, some manipulation, some sort of cutting or folding or moulding or chiselling, sewing or binding, biting or chewing. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. This idea of how touch relates to sculpture, perhaps how we can think of this is that what is made is something that belongs alone to the nature or to the idiom of that language. And Rodin's language, of course, is sculpture. So the idea that touch, how we exercise touch in the world, is inextricably bound up with the language that we use in the world. And I'm not only talking about natural language, whether we speak English or French or Chinese or whatever, but what is actually the medium, what is our language, whether we draw or we sculpt or we use our bodies to perform. This is the way we touch the world, and this is the way in which we give shape to the world through our sense of touch. So a number of contemporary philosophers have written in great detail about the ethics of touch, because while it is possible to see without being seen, it is not possible to touch and at the same time being touched. One never emerges intact from any contact, any touching. Jacques Derrida, as a philosopher interested in the phenomenology of language, is fascinated by the role of touch. He construes the experience of reading a text in terms of tactile textures, of haptic performances within an ethical dimension. Derrida claims that a reader who just looks at a text without touching it is avoiding entry into the text. To look but without, as he says, laying a hand on the object, is to act with extreme complacency. And the wonderful Lithuanian French philosopher Immanuel Levinus describes the role of touch as a model for understanding. He says the connection between vision and touch, between representation and labour, remains essential. Vision, Levinas says, moves into grasp. Vision opens up a perspective upon a horizon and invites the hands to movement and to contact. The form of objects call for the hand and the grasp. By the hand, the object is in the end comprehended, touched, taken, borne and referred to other objects, clothed with signification. So it's a very, very interesting ethical dimension that people like Levinus and Derrida add to this notion of touch, because we know ourselves that sight very often lies. We see illusions. Even when you're driving on the road, you see water there, which of course is not really there. But there's a sense in which literally the sense of touch does not lie. It tells us so much about reality, and we think very often that the first language, the first way in which we came into the world, the first language that ever touched us was literally the hand, perhaps, of our mothers stroking our faces or whatever. So touch is really the first language. It is primal, and it's a language that has the most extraordinary ethical dimension in the way that sight does not, because sight is very much about a sort of distancing as well. Levinas urges us to use sight as a way to approach, but of course sight is a way that can distance in a way that physically touching somebody never does. So the apprehension of the face of another person, the other, that is to say everything that is not me, that is outside myself, comes to be revealed through language. This suggests that words, like hands, are a form of touch, and from which one does not emerge untouched. So the interplay between sight as touch and touch as sight plays itself out in so many different contexts. As a sculptor, I am particularly fascinated by the way the touch of the hands can be a form of seeing, and how knowledge accrues and resides in them. The kinesthetic sensations and haptic experiences inscribed in the hands augment and at times even represent and substitute for the eyes themselves. What are called in neurology the Gnostic systems are of particular interest in sculpture, as they tend towards clarity of perception by drawing us to an object or experience. The Gnostic systems allow for gnosis, or perception, perceptive use of the hands, a form of thinking that is so often unacknowledged or unrecognised. Through them, we possess internal tactile images which allow us to recognise or identify and interrogate things through touch. They facilitate a repertoire of memory that develops from the time of infancy onwards. And there's a very, very beautiful moment at the start of Rilke's essay on Rodin, where he asks the audience to reflect on their first childhood objects, to think about those first objects, whether they were little wooden toys or pieces of cloth that we first owned as a child. And in this, for anyone that's interested in the wonderful, wonderful writing of D.W. Winnicott, the British child psychoanalyst, who then went on to develop ideas of the transitional objects, you could really take that right back to Rilke's first observations of Rodin, and that sense where he urges the audience to reflect on those first things that we touched as children. Because Rilke says that we can never be without those things. We can never be without a sense of touch and a relationship to things. And this is, for Rilke, the origin of all sculpture, and it has to be the origin of how we come to appreciate and love sculpture. So in sculpture, the capacity of the hands to perceive form and retain tactile images or impressions of that form are inextricably bound up to making. In modelling a portrait or a body in clay, the role of the Gnostic systems of the hands becomes important. One soon becomes aware of the complex dialectic that develops between visual perception and tactile perception. A tension develops as one struggles to translate what is apprehended visually into the clay form being manipulated. Often those subtle variations of the planes of the skull or the cheeks, for example, elude vision. And it is often useful to close one's eyes in order to see through touch, to feel how these forms actually exist in reality. I know for many, many years I taught a life modelling class in the sculpture department at the VCA and at Presa, and always with first-year students, we would start with a portrait, for example, and we'd have a model sitting in the middle of the room, and the students would be modelling a life-size portrait. And there was always this fascination from my part, very much just watching them, their sort of frustration as it seemed to be that what they were seeing would always evade what was being modelled. And you would see heads, heads that looked like balloons being made, and you would, even though the model would have a shaved head, and you'd say to I'd often say to the student, "What's going wrong with this work? What's not working for you?" And they'd keep looking at their work thinking that they simply could never tell you what was going wrong with it. And then I'd simply say to them, "Well, close your eyes and touch that lump of clay in front of you." And the minute they did that, they could start to feel what was wrong with the work. The reason they could feel that is simply because we all have very, very well-developed Gnostic systems. We live with our bodies. We know intimately what a human body feels like. And so often in Rodin's work, you see time and time again that his hands were the basic modelling tools that he worked with. And in any sort of figurative sculpture, you see that's modelled from clay, really your hand is your best tool, because to do a form like modelling a form of the shoulder, for example, the hand fits perfectly into that form itself. And this is what you so often see in Rodin's work, the way the hand has simply moved across the surface, bashing the clay into shape to form some sort of really strange anatomy, but an anatomy that is utterly convincing. So it's these Gnostic systems which actually sculptors have developed to an extraordinary degree that are in play when they're working. So the hand gives shape to materials, to words or to ideas. And I talk about this because when I say to words, philosophers will often talk about the hand that writes. So it's the hand that not only gives, for sculptors, that gives shape to materials. For philosophers, it's the hand that writes, that shapes their work. It gives form, so to materials, to words, or to ideas. It gives form, it gives an architecture, a structure within an idiom, a grammar and a syntax. And hands do so, Derrida and others suggest, without seeing. In a sense, this is similar to the way hands acquire other patterns of gestures, such as those used in sewing and knitting and weaving. In fact, Derrida describes a childhood memory of the women in his family who, raising their eyes, he says, from their woolen threads, but without stopping or ever slowing the movement of their agile fingers, continue their work. And this image of the women in his family moving their hands without looking at what they're doing is the image that Derrida very much develops in his writing in what he calls his Penelopean texts. Those images taken from Penelope, from unthreading, undoing the weaving. Penelope, of course, the figure from ancient Greek mythology. For Rodin, the body is never an isolated, closed system or sum of parts. And I just want to sort of make this point that Nancy develops an extraordinary ethics from his own sense of embodiment. He had a heart transplant something like 15 years ago, and it's this sense of owning the heart of another human being in his own body, yet his own body constantly rejecting that heart, as what happens in the case of transplants, that leads Nancy to actually led him to write a beautiful text called L'Intrus, The Intruder, where he argues that in order to approach the stranger, the other in our community, the refugee, or whoever, we have to approach them in their strangeness, in their otherness. What is different, that's what we have to accept. So this, as I said, is based on Nancy's own heart transplant and the struggle to take the other's heart into his own body. So Nancy concludes a very, very beautiful essay about the body called Corpus. He writes in this essay, "There is no body. Indeed, instead, there are patient and fervent recitations of numerous bodies, ribs, skulls, pelvises, irritations, shells, diamonds, drops, foams, mosses, excavations, fingernail moons, minerals, acids, feathers, thoughts, claws, slates, pollens, shoulders, domes, suns, anuses, eyelids, dribbles, liquids, slits, blocks, slicing, squeezing, removing, bellowing, smashing, burrowing, spoiling, piling up, sliding, exhaling, leaving, flowing." And there the essay finishes mid-sentence. In my mind, Nancy's lists and accounts of the sharing of the property of bodies recall something of Rilke's observation of the single, continuous surface of things and of life. This is perhaps what links Rilke and Rodin and Nancy. It is what links sculpture to philosophy and philosophy to sculpture. There really is only one single surface, the convoluted, twisting, meandering, permeable surface which suffers 1,000 changes and transformations.